Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out in our blustery weather. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Noah Burris is our Collections and Exhibits Manager here at the Pipestone County Museum, and he's going to be sharing and telling us about rationing during World War II and sharing some of the artifacts that we have related to the topic in our collection. So thank you, Noah.
Thank you, Travis. So yes, I will be discussing rationing in World War II in the United States. So other European countries had their own rationing programs. I'm just focusing on the United States. So the need for rationing. During World War I and prior to the US entering World War II, the government asked people to ration voluntarily. Wasn't the most successful. You had people hoarding stuff, people raising prices, so they realized they were probably going to have to implement a mandatory rationing program. There were shortages of certain items that existed well before the United States entered the war, and part of those reasons were they were supplying allies. They were submarines, especially German U-boats, were disrupting shipping lanes. There were shortages of foods grown in other countries because they were disrupted during the war. So before the US even entered the war, there were issues with supplies. The Office of Price Administration, or OPA, was established in 1941, and it was set to control the prices of goods and services. So after the US entered the war, after Pearl Harbor, there was a demand for raw materials, including things like steel, leather, fabrics, wood, aluminum, and rubber, that skyrocketed as the materials and manufacturing capacity went to war production. So there were three main things that they were trying to solve by implementing a rationing program. One was to create a system to more fairly distribute goods that were in short supply. Two was to prevent hoarding, and three was to prevent inflation by having price controls. So the OPA and the government would set ceiling prices, which were as high as retailers could charge for prices. They could charge under that, but they couldn't go over it. So the authority to ration was set by the Priorities and Allocation Act of 1940. Congress gave the power to the president to allocate scarce commodities. The Second War Powers Act of 1942 expanded those powers, and those powers and responsibilities were delegated to the Office of Price Administration, so they oversaw the rationing program. And they had help from other government agencies, including the War Production Board, but they were the main organization that ran the rationing programs. So the first claims for commodities were presented to allocation authorities for the military and allies, and then they would certify the amounts available for citizens in the United States. So the administration of the rationing program happened on four levels. There was the national office in Washington, D.C., where they formed policies, regulations were written and amended. Then there was 8 regional offices that supervised the administration of policies and procedures, 93 district offices that had jurisdiction over the local boards, and then more than 5,600 war price and rationing boards, which were also known as your local boards, and those were made up of volunteers. They were often called committees of neighbors because it was all your neighbors making up the members, and they interacted with the local citizens and fellow community members. Methods of rationing. So there were kind of 4 different ways they rationed items. So there was the uniform coupon rationing, and that provided equal shares of a single commodity. Coupons were good for a stated quantity and issued to all consumers. So that was for items like sugar, coffee, shoes. Then there was point rationing, where it provided equivalent shares of a group of commodities. Ration coupons were good for points which the consumer could spend on any combination of items in the group, and that was for processed foods, meats, fats, dairy. There was differential coupon rationing, which provided variable shares of a single commodity to consumers according to their need. So that was, coupons were issued only with an application, so you had to apply for it to show why you needed it, how much you needed it, and that was things like gasoline and fuel oil. So not everyone got the same amount of those items. The prior 2 ones, people would get the same number of ration coupons no matter what. And then there was certificate rationing, and that was an allotment of single items to individual buyers, only again after an application, and you had to demonstrate why you needed that object. And that included tires, automobiles, typewriters, bicycles, rubber footwear, stoves. So not only did the rationing program have to distribute items fairly among citizens, it had to do it for retailers, institutions, manufacturers. So you would have ration programs that had to provide for hospitals, restaurants, bakers, things like that, trucking companies. So they had to as well present ration coupons. So as you as a consumer went into a store and presented your coupons or stamps, then the retailer would also have to use coupons or stamps. And that was because if you just have the consumer presenting stamps and then the retailer can still pay with money, if you had bigger, larger, more successful retailers, they'd be able to buy up more items than your smaller mom and pop businesses. So they had what was called flowback, and that was to control the goods through supply channels. So ration currency was transferred from consumers to retailers, from retailers to wholesalers, and then from wholesalers to manufacturers or other producers. And then when it reached the top level at that point, where the ration goods originated from, the ration currency had to be surrendered back to the OPA. So there were different types of ration currency known as stamps or coupons. So every American was issued a series of ration books. There were 5 printed, but only 4 of them were issued. So that one had the individual coupons that you could rip out that had different points levels for your items. Then there were separate stamps and coupons for, say, gas, mileage rationing, stuff like that. And then there were the certificates you had to fill out if you needed tires, you wanted a new car, you wanted a new stove. That's where you had to fill out a certificate, and then your local rationing board would review it and determine if you were eligible to get a new one. And then tokens, which are these little bottom red ones here. They came in red and blue, and those were issued with Ration Book 4 and used as change, essentially. So if you paid with your ration stamps, and the stamps added up to more than what the item was worth, they handed you back the tokens that you could then use when you bought goods later on. So the first big thing after the US entered the war was needed rubber. So December 11th, 1941, right after Pearl Harbor, the government stopped all tire sales. 3/4 of rubber in the United States was used for car tires, and 90% of the world's natural rubber supply came from Southeast Asia. So as Japan took over that area of the world, they had control of the natural rubber trade. We could no longer get it, so rubber was a big one that needed rationed. It was used for military vehicles, boots, gas masks, raincoats, all sorts of military items. Gas masks needed 1.11 pounds of rubber. Life rafts needed 17 to 100 pounds, and a single battleship required over 75 tons of rubber. So you could see why that was the first item that they needed to start rationing, as they needed to build up military capabilities. So the first actual item they then rationed was tires. So January 5th, 1942, tire rationing begins. They would often pause sales before the rationing went into effect to prevent people from hoarding, and it would vary. Sometimes it'd be weeks or a week. There were certain items that they just announced the day before that it was paused, and then it would be going on rationing. So it kind of varied by item, but the main goal was to keep people from going out and buying up a bunch of items they didn't need. So citizens were allowed to keep 5 tires, 4 on their car and 1 spare. Any remaining tires they had were supposed to be sold back to the government under the idle tire purchase plan. They were required to have frequent tire inspections to make them last longer. So you would have people inspect your tires to look for smaller damages that could be fixed before you had a blowout or flat tire. And then they would also check air pressure to make sure it was at the correct level. It was supposed to be properly rated at 30 pounds of pressure. So if you were at 27 pounds, you wore through your tires 21% quicker. And if it was at 21 pounds, it cut the tire's lifetime in half. So that is why they would tell people to frequently get your tires checked. And so there in the newspaper, they would run ads reminding you if you had your tires inspected. And Montgomery Ward was one of the official tire inspection stations in Pipestone. So you could only have, just a little bit more on tires, you could only have your current tires patched or replace the treads. The rationing board would issue you certificates if you needed new tires or even to retread your tires. If you needed the new tires, you'd apply to them. The first month in Pipestone County, they only were able to provide 12 tires for passenger vehicles and 27 tires for trucks and buses. So that kind of told you the limited amount they were able to dole out to people. Doctors, nurses, and fire personnel were able to buy new tires because they had more essential jobs. Still had to kind of go through the application process. And then the ration boards would also tell people if your tires were in good condition to write down the serial number, because people were prone to steal tires that were in good condition. So the next item that was rationed was automobiles. So in February 1942, the government ceased the manufacture and sale of all civilian cars. Car factories were converted to the war effort, so they could build jeeps, tanks, ambulances, airplanes. The government stockpiled cars, the new cars, to be rationed out later then. So you had to apply to purchase apply for a certificate to get a new car, just like the tires. And again, critical workers got precedent over that. Necessary workers like police and doctors were eligible, but they still had to show that their car was old, they needed a new one, and it had to have over 40,000 miles. Otherwise, you had no chance at getting one, essentially. They also implemented the wartime motor vehicle tax, and that is where you had to pay a tax to the government, and then you put a sticker in your window. It was implemented in February 1942, so the first one ran through June and cost you $2.09, and then you would purchase a new one in July for the government's calendar year, and it cost $5, so it averaged about to 42 cents a month to pay your wartime motor vehicle use tax. Typewriters were rationed in 1942 of March. They needed the metal and also just the machines themselves for all the war correspondents and clerks that were typing up information. Civilians were asked to donate any non-essential typewriters to the effort, and if you then needed one later on, you would apply to your local rationing board to rent one from a government stockpile. So many items were just not available, so they might not have been explicitly rationed by the government, but they were removed from the market or hard to get just based on the materials that were used to make it. So on March 31st, 1942, it was the last day to manufacture items using tin, steel, copper, aluminum, nickel, chrome, various other metals for non-military goods. So many items from these materials, including metal toys, cutlery, radios, refrigerators, washing machines, just kind of disappeared from the market because they weren't able to make them. They weren't rationed under the program. You just weren't able to buy one because they weren't in the stores. Now, many businesses changed their processes, adapted to fit into the rationing rules. So packaging changed to jars and boxes. You would have canned dog food companies that couldn't use tin anymore. They moved to dehydrated dog food that they could put in boxes or cardboard cans. Aluminum pots and pans were replaced with enamelware. A lot of toys were made from wood and cardboard. In the County Star, we're getting into Christmas time, they advertised one of the stores selling toys, a Scotty dog made out of plastic and wood, and then a dump truck that was all wood constructed. So toys you probably would have seen made out of metal previous to the war, they started moving to different materials that they could use. You also even saw the Girl Scouts sold calendars instead of cookies, as they couldn't get sugar and the different, various goods to get their cookies. So clothing limitations. Limits on the use of fabrics changed how civilians dressed. There were no more, double-breasted suits, vests, cuffs on pants, patch pockets, pleated skirts, long hemlines, one-piece bathing suits. There were restrictions, so hems and belts could not exceed 2 inches in width, and garments could not have more than one pocket. People mended their clothing and sewed their own clothes using feed sacks. And then, since nylon and silk weren't available during the war, women would often paint using foundation, their legs to make it look like they were wearing stockings, including doing the seam down the back of their leg. Sugar was the first food item rationed, and that was in April 1942. Sales were halted by the government. Again, that was to avoid people going out and hoarding it, so they would halt sales first. May 1942, they actually started rationing it, and that is when you got Ration Book 1. So that first allotted 26 pounds per person per year for sugar, and so the first ration book was only for sugar. Restaurants, hotels, and hospitals had to cut their sugar use in half, and industry, so people using sugar to bake, they were cut by 30%. Now, some people thought sugar rationing was unnecessary. You kind of got into some conspiracy theories even back then that people suggested the cutbacks were just to promote the health of Americans, and it wasn't needed because they didn't have sugar. So there was a cartoon there that ran in the paper where it said, "Blame them, not Uncle Sam, the rats who put the rat in rationing." And you've got Uncle Sam, or a U.S. citizen there, punching Hitler. So that kind of plays into the people thinking it was unnecessary. They're saying, don't blame the government, blame the enemy. So War Ration Book 1 was issued May 4th through 7th, 1942. Originally issued for sugar rationing, like I mentioned, so it was also called the Sugar Book, contained 28 stamps that you would then use for sugar. You registered at your local school. The teachers were the registrars, so they took everyone's information, filled out the information. And when you went to pick up the book, you had to say how much sugar you already had in your house, and they would remove the appropriate amount of stamps since you already had that sugar in your house. Stamps were good for 2-week periods, and then stamps 19 through 28 were later designated for coffee. Gasoline was rationed in May 1942, starting on the East Coast. And that was to allow the government to establish overland delivery routes, including rail cars, tanker trucks, barges, new pipelines. A victory speed limit was set across the United States at 35 miles per hour, again to save on gas, but also the main focus was really largely to reduce wear on tires, as rubber was more important. They did want to save gas too, but they also were really focusing on the rubber tire angle. So a nationwide rationing went into effect in December 1942. Every car had to put a sticker in its front windshield showing how much gasoline they were able to have. So there were 3 main stickers and then some various other ones for different vehicles. So A was for most drivers, most common sticker. It allowed 2 to 4 gallons of gasoline per week. B was for people who commuted long distances to work and also carried 3 or more passengers. That was 8 to 10 gallons per week. And then C was for one of 17 different war critical jobs. And so fields included government workers, school workers, medical workers, construction, military, press, clergy, mail delivery, farming, etc. And they got unlimited gasoline. There was also different stickers for D, E, R, and T for motorcycles, emergency vehicles, trucks, commercial vehicles. And then there was also what was called the X sticker, big X on it, and that was for VIPs, again, unlimited gasoline. Controversially, it went to a number of congressional members, which people were not happy about, why they needed unlimited gasoline. So when you had the sticker system, you would go up to the gas station, you'd have the sticker in your window. The gas attendant would check the sticker in the window and compare it to your ration book to make sure that the letter matched and that the license plate matched to say that you had that ability to get that amount of gas. So you could lose your access to gasoline if you kept more than 5 tires, if you were caught speeding, or if you did pleasure driving or joyriding, as people would probably call it. And so the government defined that as no basic ration may be used for pleasure driving, which shall include but shall not be limited to driving for the purpose of attending places of amusement, recreation, or entertainment, such as theaters, amusement parks, concerts, dances, golf courses, skating rinks, bowling alleys, or nightclubs, or sporting or athletic events such as races or games, or for sightseeing, touring, or vacation traveling, or for making social calls. Now, they did exempt soldiers that were home on furlough, so they could make social visits and were not caught under the pleasure driving then. Bicycles were also rationed. So first, the government set manufacturing guidelines shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor. They introduced what were called victory bicycles. And so that was specific specifications that were built and designed for adults. Children bicycle production was halted during the war. Lightweight victory bicycles were under 31 pounds, about a third lighter than pre-war bicycles. They used steel, no copper or nickel parts, and minimum chrome plating. Handlebars and wheel trims were painted. Chain guards, bells, and white wall tires were removed, and tire width was set to a maximum of 1 3/8 inch. So on April 3rd, 1942, the government forbade bicycles from leaving a factory, job, or wholesaler or retailer's place of business after 11:59 p.m., but they weren't officially rationed until July 1942. At that point, you again had to apply to get a certificate to your local rationing board. You had to prove you needed a bicycle, so mainly you needed it to get to your job, and you had to prove that there was no good, reliable public transportation. August, they further limited it to even more critical occupations like healthcare workers, school teachers, firefighters, as the demand for bicycles far outweighed the available supply. Fuel oil and kerosene were rationed in October 1942, so that was your range oil, coal oil, stove oil, tractor fuel, furnace oil. That was one of the items allocated by need. So you would see people in northern climates, they needed more of it. They would get more ration supply than in southern states where they didn't need as much heating oil. In January 1943, there was actually an article in the Star that was stating that all businesses or buildings, non-home dwellings, had to convert to coal-burning equipment due to the lack of fuel oil available. And there you see the stamps there permitting delivery of fuel oil. Coffee was rationed in first they tried to limit coffee in April of 1942. So they took how much roasting companies could use and limited that to 75% of the previous year's amount. And then in September, they lowered it again to 65%. As demand stayed high to pre-war levels of about 20 pounds per person, they then rationed it on November 29th, 1942. So like I mentioned earlier, the OPA designated a set of stamps in Ration Book 1 for coffee purchases. Originally, every adult over the age of 15 could get 1 pound of coffee every 5 weeks. They then lowered that in February of 1943 to reduce to 1 pound every every 6 weeks, which made less than a cup of coffee a day for coffee drinkers. So shoes were frozen on the February 8th and then rationed starting February 9th. So that was one of the items that they kept a very short freezing period before they rationed it. It was all shoes containing any leather and rubber-soled shoes. Previous ration order from October 1942 covered 6 types of men's rubber work boots and shoes. Stamp 17 from Ration Book 1 was used for shoes, and you would get 3 coupons per year. You could apply for a special certificate if your shoes were lost in fire or flood. Secondhand shoe stores gained popularity as you did not need ration stamps to buy used items, so a lot of people started frequenting them more often. There were also new rules about what shoes could be made. Only 4 colors, black, white, town brown, and army russet, were available. 2-tone shoes prohibited, band boots taller than 10 inches, band heels taller than 2 5/8 inches, and no fancy tongues, non-functional trimmings, stuff like that. Manufacturers started to introduce shoes that were made out of other materials that weren't rationed. So you would see materials, mostly plastics, but they also used pressed carpet, felt, old brake lining material, and even reclaimed fire hose to make shoes to get around the rationing program. Now, some people were concerned that you were giving people 3 coupons, that some people were just using the coupons not to waste them, and that they really didn't need 3 shoes a year. And then you also had concerns about people paying off shop owners to get shoes even though they didn't have the right coupon. So War Ration Book 2 was issued in February 1943 and originally used for canned goods, processed foods. Later meat was added. So all stamps used on the point system. Blue stamps were for processed foods. They were lettered, so A, B, and C were to be used during March 1943, and then stamps D and F were used end of March to end of April, so they timelined when you could use the stamps. And then how did they work? So when you had the first ration book, sugar, it was fairly easy because you just had the stamps for sugar. When they started to ration more types of foods, it got a little more complicated. So different kinds of foods took different amounts of points. The more you buy, the more points it costs. So, bigger cans of food cost more than smaller cans of food. The government would set points for each kind and size of item, and they had an official table of point values that was to be displayed in your grocery store so you knew how much items cost. So there is a little snippet of official table of point values. So items were added or removed from the ration list during the war. Point values changed. Stamps expired at set times. So you only had set times to use the stamps, and after that, they were no longer usable. And then you had to pay the correct number of ration stamps plus the money price of the item. So it wasn't just like you were paying the ration stamps instead of money, you had to pay both. So you would often see ration calendars posted in the calendar that told you when you could use your coupon. So if you look at that one, coffee, February 7th, coupon number 28, 1 pound valid until this date. Sugar, January 31st, coupon number 10, 3 pounds expires on this date. And then that one, you've kind of got a breakdown of the letter system with the points, red stamps, blue stamps, sugar stamps. Processed foods were rationed beginning in March 1943. Canned, frozen, dried, or otherwise prepackaged food. Over 3,000 processed foods were rationed during the war. And blue stamps in ration books 2, 3, and 4 were used for processed foods. Fresh fruits and vegetables were not rationed. So even though they were not rationed, people still participated in the Victory Gardens. So government reintroduced the idea of war gardens from World War I, renamed them Victory Gardens, just like the Victory speed limit. That was Victory war bonds. That was kind of their go-to. It freed up produce and resources for the war effort. People would grow them on farms, backyards, city rooftops, public lands, vacant lots. And in 1944, it supplied 40% of the country's fresh vegetables. So a large number of people participated and were able to grow a decent amount of fruits and vegetables in Victory Gardens. Cheese, canned milks, and fats were rationed as well in March 1943. Animal fats were not just used for food, they were also processed to make glycerin, which was a key ingredient in explosives like nitroglycerin, and was used to make bullets, bombs. It was also needed for war-critical pharmaceuticals, paint for tanks and planes, and dyeing uniforms. So red stamps from ration books 2, 3, and 4 were used for cheese, dairy products, meat as well. To ensure margarine was not being sold as butter, it could only be colored yellow by the consumer, so it came with a little coloring packet. In the store, it could not be yellow to not, confuse people. And fresh milk was also not rationed. Meats and canned fish were also rationed in March 1943. So March 1943 is kind of when they went all in on rationing the food items. There were many campaigns promoting using organ meats to rebrand it as variety meats. So you'd see a lot of magazines, newspapers putting out recipes for people to use. This booklet was put out by the American Meat Institute, 120 wartime meat recipes. And you can see the two dishes there, omelet with brains and pork liver loaf. So they were really trying to get people to use those new variety meats. Again, red stamps from ration books 2, 3, and 4 were used for meat as well as the dairy products. Poultry, eggs, and fresh fish, again, were not rationed. So a lot of the fresh products were not rationed because they didn't require the tin or metal containers that were needed, and they couldn't be sent over to the soldiers in Europe because they would have expired before they got there. War Ration Book 3 was issued in summer 1943. So some of the dates on when the books were issued get a little dicey because you had different timelines. So you had the date you would apply for it, you had the date it was delivered but not necessarily given out. It was kept under lock and key by your local war rationing board. Then you'd have the date it was issued, you'd have the date it was valid to be used. So summer 1943 was around when War Ration Book 3 was issued. And you can see the stamps there, got a tank and what looks like kind of a boat or something on it. And again, numbered, so that would tell you based off of when they set the values and prices what you could use them for. War Ration Book 4 was issued the end of October 1943, and it had 8 pages of 384 stamps. Again, color-coded letters, numbers, told you the point values, when they were available, what they were used for. Tokens were introduced with Ration Book 4, and they were used as change. So if you overpaid with your ration, stamps adding up, they would hand you back the tokens as change for it that you could then use later on. And this book was designed to last for 2 years. Prior to that, they had kind of been sending them out every 5 months or so. So they were trying to elongate that process. So consumers were not the only ones, civilians in the US who had to ration. Military members had ration cards as well. So this is a ration card that Boyd Cochran of the Coast Guard had on the USS Meigs. And as you can see, candy, cigarettes, watches were the main things rationed on this, and he pretty much cashed in on the candy and cigarettes there. So he is in that photo there wearing the white hat on the right, and then there's an image of the ship he served on, or I guess transported over on. So the black market was a major problem during the rationing process. So black market describes trade in goods and services illicitly or outside of legal systems. The war effort generally had public support, but people did not like going out without things. And one of the biggest things they didn't like going without was meat, specifically steak. So meatlegging, play off of the term bootlegging, was branded. And the OPA estimated that as much as 17% of the nation's meat trade was via the black market. 5% of gasoline was used on forged or stolen coupons. Legitimate coupons and counterfeits were bought, sold, and traded against the law. And OPA instructed sellers not to accept unendorsed or loose stamps. So you were supposed to go in with your stamp book. They were supposed to still be in the book. And your consumer was supposed to, or the store owner was supposed to rip the stamps themselves. Now, a lot of them would look the other way if you came in with loose stamps and still accept them, but they were trying to counteract, counterfeit stamps. Several ration book forgery rings across the country, including runs run by organized crime, were found. Targeted thefts of coupons from local rationing boards often happened despite them being kept under lock and key. And thefts of restricted goods, including siphoning gasoline, taking tires off of cars, were not uncommon. And on the back of every ration book, they would put, never buy ration goods without ration stamps and never pay more than the legal price. So that was just two of the ways they were trying to get the consumer to help fight against black market issues. Items come off the ration list. So like I mentioned, items were added and removed during the war. So coffee actually came off in July 1943. The OPA did have to raise the price again in September of 1944 to control demand, but raising the price did avoid them having to ration coffee again. Lard was removed in March 1944. In April of 44, shortening oils and typewriters were removed. September of 44, bicycles. August of 45, processed foods, gasoline, fuel oil, kerosene stoves. And August of 45, the victory speed limit was ended. So as you see, the war comes to an end, more items start coming off the list. So end of war, end of rationing, you would think, right? Well, not necessarily. They kind of had to still ease some items off the list. So as the war ended in August, they signed the official treaty in September. You still had items after that were rationed. In October of 45, cars and shoes were removed off the list. November of 45, meat, cheese, canned milk, butter, margarine. December of 45, tires were removed. And then you still had the motor vehicle use tax until June of 1946, so they cashed on that a little bit longer. And then sugar was the last item rationed and longest item rationed until June of 1947. That was mainly to make up for low crop yields in previous years, and there was such a short supply that is the reason they kept that rationed as long as they did. Any questions?
No.
Well, so you got like a new sugar book every year?
No. So you got issued book 1, and then you got issued book 2, which had sugar stamps in it as well that you could use for sugar, but it included the stamps for other items.
So you could rely on getting more stamps
Yes.
every year?
Well, it varied when they sent out the books. Like I said, between books 1, 2, and 3, they said it averaged about 5 months. I don't know the exact timeline that you got one. And then when they issued book 4, they created it designed to last you 2 years. And that was sent out at the end of 43, so it really wasn't fully tested because...
And if you didn't use them, you lost them?
Yes, because they expired. They set the timeline that you could use them for.
And if I only needed 2 pairs of shoes, I wasn't supposed to give my buddy?
No, so the shoe ration one specifically, they said if you only needed 2, you could use them on immediate family members, or if you lived in the same dwelling, you could share it. So like if your kids ran through shoes quicker, you could give them your ration stamp. But outside of your house, you were not supposed to trade, sell.
Supposed to?
Yes, people obviously did, but...
And you said everybody got a coupon book, so presumably adults and children.
Yes, 1 through 4, every American got a ration book, including babies. There were some slight differences. Coffee, you had to be over 15 for the coffee stamps. So I'm guessing when you went to pick up the ration book, they looked at the age and would have removed the
That's what I was
corresponding
gonna
coffee
ask.
stamps
I'm
if you were
like,
under
so
that
on
age.
coffee, if you had a child that wasn't 15, did you get to use their, but you're saying no, they would have removed it. The other thing I caught that I found fascinating, on the typewriters, they were asking citizens and businesses to turn in typewriters if they weren't necessary, but then if you later needed one, you could pay to rent back the one you turned in, so to speak. You could pay to rent.
You had to, yeah, you had to
If you
apply
turned
to the
one
ration
in, they
board.
didn't just go, oh, here, you can have it back, you now have to, what would be the impetus to turn one in and for fear you might need it again?
Victory!
Yeah, patriotic
Yeah.
duty.
Supporting the war effort, thank you.
So
Fascinating.
did babies just automatically get issued ration cards when they were born?
I believe you had to apply for them. So
You
you would have,
had to
yeah,
register
you would
the
have had to
baby.
go to your ration board and say, we just had the baby, we need the book now for them.
So if you had 8 children, you obviously would get coupons for sugar, and in that case, mom maybe could make a cake a little more often than the family with 1 child that got less sugar for their household.
Yep.
Interesting. Well, thanks, Noah.
Thanks for coming.